On Contact with Chris Hedges. Hi, welcome to On Contact. Today we'll discuss exonerations with investigative journalist Alison Flowers.
But you literally leave, perhaps not even with your own clothes on your back. And I've heard of exonerees getting charged for their prison shoes in a bill in the mail later after leaving prison. So you leave with nothing. You're not a multimillionaire. In fact, those cases are very rare.
On Contact, neoliberalism, patriotism. Truth is not socialism, obedience, class war, corporate coup d'etat, utopian ideology of neoliberalism, revolt en masse. On Contact with Chris Hedges. The breakdown of the American judicial system means that tens of thousands of people, and the number may be much higher, are serving sentences for crimes they did not commit. Most of these innocents are poor people of color. They have no access to funds to fight back in the courts and languish, many with life sentences, in cages until old age or death. Their stories, told through the less than 2,000 formerly incarcerated who have been exonerated since 1989, is a damning indictment of the American system of mass incarceration, which criminalizes poverty. Even when injustices are reversed, something that takes hundreds of thousands of dollars in pro bono legal work, the exonerated are almost always cast adrift. The state usually fails to provide adequate compensation to those whose lives the justice system has destroyed. Anya Parampil examines the propensity of the American court system to imprison tens of thousands of innocents among our 2.2 million incarcerated.
The United States leads the world in prison rates, with 2.2 million people languishing in either American jails or prisons, according to the Sentencing Project. The U.S. holds a quarter of the global prison population. The U.S. prison rate is 737 per 100,000. But let's go back to that other number again, 2.2 million people behind bars. What if I told you 2 million of them have never faced a trial? That's because 95% of all state felony cases and 97% of federal cases end in a guilty plea, not a jury trial. Due to the high cost of trials, overworked defense lawyers, and pressure from judges, millions of Americans have opted to plead guilty rather than prove their innocence. The result, according to the Innocence Project, is that an estimated 2.3 to 5% of U.S. prisoners are innocent. To put that in perspective, just considering that conservative estimate alone would mean about 50,000 innocent people are behind bars. But since 1989, only 1,829 people have been exonerated. 2015 broke records for exoneration, seeing 149 people walk free. The exonerations came in 29 states and the District of Columbia, as well as 3 federal cases and 1 in Guam. In Texas alone, 54 people were exonerated. The Sixth Amendment guarantees an individual's right to a speedy and public trial. But as it stands, the vast majority of prisoners aren't receiving anything but time behind bars. And the question becomes whether or not the system could even handle proper trials in the first place.
Joining me to discuss the plight of innocents caught up in the system of mass incarceration is Alison Flowers, the author of Exoneree Diaries, The Fight for Innocence, Independence, and Identity. Flowers followed the struggle of 4 exonerees. Her book is a window into the deep emotional toll and the difficulties faced by those who are trying to reintegrate after years of imprisonment. Thank you, Alison.
Thanks for having me.
So at the beginning of your book, you throw out a statistic that's quite unsettling. 2 statistics. One, since 1989, we've had less than 2,000 people exonerated, and the Innocence Project estimates that between 2.5 and 5% of our prison population, 2.2, 2.3 million people, is innocent. That is tens of thousands of innocent people locked in cages across this country.
That's correct, and I actually think that the numbers are much higher than that.
Yeah, I do too.
There's just no mechanism to track exonerations. We've had something called the National Registry of Exonerations for a few years, some researchers at the University of Michigan who are tracking these cases the best they can through news reports and through tips. But it's not like when someone's case is overturned or when a conviction is vacated, there's some way to alert the public that that has happened. And these only go back as far as 1989. And so we reckon that there are a lot more than that. And from talking to the exonerees in my book, they certainly believe that the number of people in prison who are innocent is much higher than 2 to 5%. But even if that's true, 2 to 5%, a pretty conservative figure, you think of the 2.3 million people locked up in this country, and that's potentially hundreds of thousands of people.
40% of people who are exonerated pled guilty. Why?
Well, when you are incarcerated or when you are facing a wrongful conviction, whether you did it or not, you are really incentivized to go ahead and move on with your life and try and make the best deal for yourself. It's the same question as to why people take plea deals in about 80% of cases, whether they're innocent or guilty. Most of the time, the chief offense that anyone faces when they're going into prison is just being poor and wanting to return to their jobs and families. And so you're really set up for failure and potentially pleading guilty to something that you didn't do.
Well, you wrote this book out of Chicago, and you write about this police officer, John Burge,
yes,
who spent 4 years in prison and ran a kind of mini Guantanamo. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that, but so many people, it wasn't just a matter of a plea, it was a matter of people being physically tortured into pleading guilty. That's correct.
He's a former police commander who ended up serving a little bit of time in federal prison, not for the torture that existed under his reign of terror.
Explain what he set up, because it was a separate black site
right
in the middle of the city.
I mean, the Burge crews, the rogue crews of cops, they tortured people into false confessions, beat more than
But they would remove them out of
right
the county jail and isolate them from their lawyers, from their families.
And unfortunately, that's still happening in the city of Chicago. We have a black site called Homan Square, where we still see Burge-like abuses. He never faced any prison time for the torture, just for lying about the torture
What
because
kind
of the statute of limitations.
I mean, you write about it in your book,
right?
But I mean, talk a little bit about what they would do to these people to force them to confess.
They would put cattle prods on men's testicles to get them to confess. They would shove rifles down people's throats. They would perform mock executions. And it's only been recently that the city of Chicago has admitted that this even happened in a way to sort of close the chapter on this. The chapter isn't closed. We know that police misconduct is still going on in the city of Chicago.
But also the ramifications are not closed because you have, what, hundreds of people
correct
who were falsely accused, whose lives were destroyed.
Right, and we know from studying the exonerations out there, the ones that we can track and the ones that we can study, we know that official misconduct is a leading cause of wrongful convictions. It accounts for half of the cases out there.
And let's be clear, this is hardly limited to Chicago. This is something that we see in large urban areas throughout the United States.
That's right. I focused on Cook County, where Chicago is, because it has the highest number of exonerations in the country, but there are several counties trailing behind Cook County as well. Here in New York, we have more than 200 exonerations since 1989 that we know of, so by no means is it a Chicago problem.
Talk a little bit about the use, and which is something you also write about in the book, the use of false witnesses, the use by police of oftentimes people who face potential time in prison themselves, who are willing to lie in order to reduce their own sentences and send people. I think in the case of one of the men you profiled was almost 3 decades. Was it a 12-year-old boy or something? But anyway, talk a little bit about that process, which is very common in the American judicial system.
Very much so. And false accusations or perjury, which is basically when someone just lies against you in court in their testimony, that is the leading cause of exonerations and wrongful convictions that we see. Several of the exonerees that we have in the book face this in their cases, and oftentimes it's either because you are being pressured by prosecutors to stick to your original identification.
Or as you point out in the book, it's often not your original identification.
Right.
But they kind of, funnel you into the identification they want.
Right, and when you're a 12-year-old boy who has witnessed a horrible murder of someone that you knew, you feel even more pressure to identify someone and to help police solve the case and help families have closure. But in most other cases, what you see is someone who is offered some sort of deal on their own case in exchange for their testimony. So you really have to look at the motivations behind why people are blaming someone else in court.
Well, there was a case you wrote about, I think he was 29 years in prison, and it was a drug addict who didn't come forward until several years later, correct? Mm-hmm. But realized as he was facing a sentence that if he made up this story about it was an arson,
right,
he could reduce his own sentence, and this guy spends 3 decades behind bars.
Right, and it was only after, you know, a quarter of a century that that witness recanted his testimony and admitted that it was all a lie. But these were, of course, things that the police could have known at the time that it was all a lie if they didn't already know it. You know,
they knew that it wasn't arson.
They knew that it wasn't arson. It had been closed as an accidental fire. Right. And then suddenly 5 years later, well, maybe it was an arson, and they send a new investigator out there. And also, you know, oftentimes what these eyewitnesses, supposed eyewitnesses, who are perjuring themselves on the stand claim to see could not have been seen.
Well, he couldn't. He said he could see it from an attic window.
Right.
That, number one, didn't have a view of the apartment house that was burned down, and the window was boarded up in winter.
Exactly, and you know, good police work would have detected that.
Is that? I mean, it's clear from the book, and that, you know, the police are complicit in creating these false charges. Do you think that's primarily because they just want to close the case? And I mean, what is the motivation, do you think? Are they just lazy, or what is it?
Well, I think police officers are put on a uniform, and part of that role in society is to solve cases. And this case had gone unsolved. A family of 6 died, right. And I think there was some pressure around that. This was actually a Burge confession case where James, the exoneree, was beaten into a confession. Yes, right. And in fact, his confession was thrown out. His beating was so bad that a Cook County judge couldn't look the other way. And so that was tossed out before he even went to trial, and yet he was still convicted. And so, but it sets in motion a prosecution against someone that is often hard to reverse. Well,
it comes down to their word against yours.
Exactly.
And if you line up on the side of law enforcement, your word, you know, you speak from almost an unassailable point, because the testimony, which is of course truthful, of the person who is convicted is disbelieved.
That's correct, and we see that time and time again in these cases.
Great. We're going to come back after a minute. When we come back, we'll hear more from Alison Flowers, the author of Exoneree Diaries.
For decades, the American middle class has been railroaded by Washington politics. Big money corporate interest has drowned out a lot of voices. That's how it is in the news culture in this country now. That's where I come in. I'm Ed Schultz. I do the news on RT America. I'll make sure you don't get railroaded, and you'll get the straight talk and the straight news. Question more. Earlier today, President Obama
Senate Republicans previously stated that the component responsible for poisoning people in Flint.
There is always hope.
That's what goes on with our politicians. What are women supposed to do? Here's something else we know.
Between the U.S.
Lawyers
and Cuba.
at the ACLU have already some degree of loss in business.
It's a huge difference.
Following the announcement, oil prices.
Nobody's talking about this story because it's garbage.
Real, genuine, and significant change.
What'd you have for breakfast yesterday? Why would you pick those shoes? How fast is your Wi-Fi? What's your dog's name? Why'd you name him that? What's your biggest fear in life? Ever been on a hayride? When's the last time you read a book? What would you say if you ever met the Pope? Who's the best quarterback of all time? What's one topping that doesn't belong on a pizza? Now, I've interviewed you too. Question more.
You're watching an RT America special report.
Man, it ain't about him. It's about you. It's about me. It's about everybody.
Basically, everything that you think you know about civil society had broken down.
There's always going to be somebody else one step ahead of the game.
We should not be in the business of normalizing violence.
We don't need people that think like this on our planet.
This is an incredibly tense situation.
On Contact with Chris Hedges. Welcome back. We continue our conversation with Alison Flowers, the author of Exoneree Diaries. So we spoke before a little bit about the collapse of the American judicial system, something poor people in this country unfortunately experience every day. We have this small number of exonerees. I mean, given the size of our prison population, it's pathetically small. As we mentioned, 2,000, less than 2,000 since 1989. And these are people who have been wrongly convicted of a crime. The judicial system has reversed the guilty verdict. And yet, so many of them are thrown back outside onto the street with no compensation, or they have to spend years in court fighting for compensation. I think you write in the book, in the state of Illinois, you can spend 30 years in prison for a crime you did not commit, and you get about, what, $200,000?
That's the
if
maximum,
you can get it. That's the
regardless
maximum.
of how long you
right.
spent.
So talk about, I mean, that's what's quite moving about the book, is families and friends have long become strangers. You've lost contact. There's a case in the book where he no longer even has contact with his mother. In your first case, it's a woman who, she gets out and her son is 16. She actually gave birth inside the prison. Her son is a stranger to her. They can't, they have all the trauma of prison. And you write at the end of the book about how people, may have gone in as saintly as a choir boy or a choir girl and come out because of the brutality within the prison system, conditioned to essentially become a criminal. So talk a little bit about that.
Right. So all exonerees, regardless of where you were convicted and what state, you leave prison without anything. No compensation, not a dime. You don't even get a bus pass. And as you know, your family has moved on. Your spouse probably divorced you. Your kids don't know who you are anymore. And your record is not automatically expunged.
Yeah, that's another issue. They're exonerated and they apply for a job, and
Exactly.
It comes up that they're a convicted killer.
Exactly. And one of the exonerees in the book, James, was turned away from a job interview for that very thing, even though he was very upfront about his wrongful conviction on his resume. They said, sorry, we don't hire convicted murderers, once they realized he wouldn't pass a background check. And so you're really set up for failure from day one. And I wanted to dispel the media myth that when you leave prison as an exoneree and you prove your innocence to the world, that suddenly you're a multi-millionaire and life is great again.
Most all of these people only leave prison because they have pro bono lawyers, one of whom you write about is a Jane Rayleigh.
Jane Rayleigh.
Unfortunately, we lost, but who will, by the time it's done, over years, takes years, have donated probably hundreds of thousands of dollars of free legal time.
Exactly. And so to leave without any system in place, it took sheer serendipity, as a great Innocence champion Rob Warden likes to say. It takes sheer serendipity to even walk out that door. A lot of things have to line up for you. You have to have a helper.
There's a moment you quote someone in the book that says in the last 24 hours, they don't want to leave the cell.
Yes, it becomes your best friend because you don't want to get hurt and the prison doesn't want you to get hurt either. But you literally leave, perhaps not even with your own clothes on your back. And I've heard of exonerees getting charged for their prison shoes in a bill in the mail later after leaving prison. So you leave with nothing. You're not a multimillionaire. In fact, those cases are very rare.
This is where you sue the state.
Where you sue the state, right? So first of all, only 30 states plus DC have any sort of compensation for exonerees.
That means that in the other 20 states...
Nothing.
Nothing. You can spend
no law, no
40
policy.
years in prison for a crime you did not commit. You get out, you have nothing.
Correct.
And you don't have Social Security.
That's right. You don't have medical, you don't have dental, which dental work is extremely important when you're getting out of prison. A lot of these exonerees have had many teeth pulled, and when you have a tooth that hurts, that's all you can think about. No counseling. That's something that these exonerees would really like. Many of them are struggling with symptoms of PTSD when they leave. And you also mentioned, what happens when an exoneree who wasn't guilty of the crime that they went into prison for, but suddenly they leave, and then they do offend on the outside.
Yeah, you write about that at the end of the book.
I do, and I think that's an important dimension to touch on. It's sort of the Stephen Avery question.
Right, Stephen Avery being the focus of a very fine documentary on Netflix, wrongly convicted of a rape, And then I think there's strong suggestion in that documentary that he gets set up because they don't want to pay him.
Right.
For a murder he did not commit, and he's back and he's still in prison.
Right, and for a long time before that docuseries aired, there was a question, well, did Stephen Avery, is he really guilty of this other offense, and did prison make him into a murderer, right? And, you know, I'm not sure about his innocence or guilt, but I do know of other cases where that has certainly happened. I wouldn't say that exonerees are more likely to commit a crime than the general population, but it certainly happens when prison has turned them into criminals.
Well, I kind of think for the Stephen Avery thing, it's the wrong question. The power of that is not, you know, did he or not commit the crime? That's the wrong question. What it makes very clear is that he never got in either case a fair trial.
Right,
and
that's
that's
set up and framed on the second charge.
Yeah,
right.
And that is such a common experience to poor people in this country.
It is, and I think what that series did, it captivated the nation because people couldn't believe that this would happen to someone. But it actually happens in hundreds of cases that I've seen. It happens in all of the cases in the book. So he's by no means exceptional, but the way it was able to capture the national attention to these issues was exceptional.
One of the things they do, and you also write about this in the book, is they slap you with, you know, child support, old fines from, you know, and you know, parking, whatever, driving.
Right.
And these accrue interest while you're in prison. So here you had a case, you know, people who've been exonerated, who did not commit the crime, they are forced to pay thousands of dollars in child support when they were making $28, $30 a month in prison.
Exactly, and most prisoners earn about $1 a day for their labor. But you have to have a lawyer who can help you through that. And even to seek compensation in the state for your wrongful conviction, you have to have a lawyer help you with that. You have to know that that process exists. And there are no immediate resources right now. The best system would be to have some sort of annuity for exonerees for every year they served and going forward, because you can't make up for that lost time.
Depression.
Yes.
Huge issue.
Of course.
Not only in prison, but once you get out.
Yes. One of the exonerees in the book wrestles with depression, at least openly. Perhaps the others do as well. And his first night back after his release from prison, he goes and finds a butcher knife from his sister's kitchen and puts it under his pillow. He just doesn't feel safe. And it's still there. He still has it tucked under his mattress with the knife handle protruding. He was smart enough not to bring it on a bus, which is where he really feels unsafe.
He thought about it.
He thought about it, but he's like, you know, this could be bad if, you know, I get caught with this knife and there could be a misunderstanding of some sort. But this is something that he lives with to this day. And he had a police detective who was not unlike Burge, has potentially wrongly convicted many Hispanic men in the Humboldt Park neighborhood of Chicago. His name is Reynaldo Guevara. And Jacques, the exoneree that we're discussing, he had this ongoing fear that this police detective was going to shoot him in the back as he was walking home to his sister's house, because he would have to turn his back slightly in order to go down that alleyway. And that was something that in prison you're used to, keeping your back to the wall and keeping your eyes out.
You write in the book about the difficulty these people have in reestablishing relationships, given the trauma that prison has done to them, with their family members, with their children, romantic relationships. Most of these people are pretty crippled.
Absolutely. You know, fortunately, there is a conference every year that the Innocence Network puts on where exonerees can be with each other. And there are several sessions dedicated to this very question. You know, how do you go on a date after decades behind bars? How do you try and parent a child who hasn't known you except through letters and occasional visits?
Which I think you made clear, you know, as those children grow older, they have less and less time not only to visit the prison, but even to write or call.
Exactly. I mean, relationships die off. James, one of the exonerees, got a call that his mother was dying. She called him.
She had cut him off completely.
She had cut him off, and that was something that was unthinkable to him. They were very close when he was growing up, and then suddenly, you know, she's calling him from her deathbed to say goodbye and to say that she's sorry. And he has no explanation for this other than just the passage of time. You lose hope that that person is ever going to join you again and your family again, and you just give up.
Well, I teach people in prison who tell their families, don't write or call me anymore, just think of me as if I'm dead, for that reason.
That's right. You feel very much like a burden to your loved ones.
Reform. I mean, we know we have tens of thousands, maybe more, people locked behind bars who did not commit the crime. They don't have money for a lawyer. There is no system. How do we confront this monstrosity of mass incarceration and a broken judicial system that railroads the poor into prison and jails?
Well, I think one thing that we need to do is to tackle police misconduct. We hear of false arrests all the time. We know how much police misconduct goes undisciplined in this country. Many states are not upfront with their data on that, but we know at least in Chicago, 97% of police misconduct complaints go completely undisciplined.
And what about the judicial system itself?
Well, who you elect to be prosecutor is so important. Oftentimes it takes a new person in office to have the courage to vacate a conviction that needs to go, that clearly has no merit anymore. And so who you elect is very important. We just unseated a state's attorney in the Chicago area, and we have someone coming in that's new that seems very promising as well. So the district attorney, the state's attorney is vitally important. But don't we have to fix the court
system? I mean, these people don't get adequate legal representation.
Right.
A public defender, 10, 15 minutes, they are pressuring you, the prosecution's all to plea out. They're all
Exactly. And we need a better bond system, or we need to eliminate the one that we have.
Right.
Because frankly, poor people are pleading guilty to crimes they may or may not have committed just so that they can move on with their lives. And that is causing them to build up criminal records that they wouldn't otherwise have.
That is, George Bernard Shaw's great line, the greatest crime is poverty and all other crimes pale beside it. Alison Flowers, the author of Exoneree Diaries, thank you.
Thank you.
A staggering 97% of all federal cases and 95% of all state felony cases are resolved through plea bargaining. Of the 2.2 million people we incarcerate, 2 million never had a trial. Close to 40% of those eventually exonerated of their crimes originally pleaded guilty in a desperate effort to reduce charges that would have resulted in much longer prison sentences if the cases had gone to trial. The public defender, who spends no more than a few minutes reviewing the case and has neither the time nor the inclination to do the work required for a trial, uses the prospect of the harsher sentence possible to frighten the client into taking a plea deal. If all of the accused went to trial, the judicial system, which is designed around plea agreements, would collapse. This is why trial sentences are horrific. It is why tens of thousands of innocent people, nearly all poor people of color, spend decades, sometimes lifetimes, locked in cages in the United States. And it is why mass incarceration is one of the most pressing civil rights issues of our time. Thank you for watching. You can find us on rt.com/oncontact. Until next week.